Cool. We're just talking about, we just started talking about John's practices. And
Yeah.
I just committed to doing a meditation, like an extra hour of meditation each morning. And so I started asking him about his practices.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm also thinking in parallel to, because I'm getting requests to about this, parallel to the After Socrates series. I've done a few of these, doing some more instructional videos on meditation, contemplation, prajna practice, some stuff probably maybe a little bit on the Qigong and the I Chuan, Tai Chi, also some maybe also on Lectio Divina and the journaling practices that I've been mentioning to you.
Yeah.
So I haven't taken it up. I've got the resources and I bought it. I want to try and take up sort of the sacred geometry practice, trying to work through Euclid's Elements and doing the geometry. Because I'm trying, in the ecology of practice idea, I'm trying to find not only the checks and balances kind of idea, the opponent processing, I'm also trying to find mediating practices, practices that mediate between kinds of knowing. So the thing about the sacred geometry is, I think it mediates between the perspectival and the propositional in a certain way.
Yeah.
And a bit of the procedural, because you actually construct the figures when you're trying to do some of the proofs and stuff like that. So, and I think it was an ancillary practice for dialectic. So I'm trying to do that. I mean, it might become part of my personal practice, but I'm doing it because I want to sort of enhance the participatory observation around dialectic. I want to try to starting that up soon. So there's a bunch of practices I do that are my ongoing practices. And then there's practices I take up as sort of a participant observer to try and get material and understanding for some of the work I'm doing.
I'm really interested about what you find with the sacred geometry. Which book are you reading, by the way? Yeah.
Hang on, I'll go get it.
Yeah.
I think this is the book you mentioned to me. It's this one.
Okay. Oh no! I got an older one of that, Sacred Geometry for Artists and Dreamers. Oh, cool. Okay, very cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and do this, and I've got Euclid's Elements, the Greek English big version, and so that's what I'm going to try and do.
Yeah.
See, because I have a set. I mean, I have a sense that because that's the only way the Greeks did math, is they only did it in geometry. They didn't have anything like algebra or what we have, calculus, of course. So I want to see if that particular way of developing sort of rigorous inferential propositional thinking, in connection with constructing figures and thinking in sort of a spatial perspectival fashion. I want to see. I have some intuitions that it interacts with the kind of cognitive flexibility and the perspectival movement and the theoria theory thing that's going on in dialectical practice.
Yeah.
So I don't know yet. It's something I want to explore. I haven't been able to find any academic work on that. I'll keep looking.
I would imagine it's an open, because I've been scouring the internet for things about what the Platonic Academy actually practiced.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot out there.
No, and I've got bits and pieces. One of the things I'd like to do is to try and also read through the Platonic Dialogues in the Neoplatonic order. So the Neoplatonists had an order in which you're supposed to read the dialogues. Again, to try and get some of that, what we've been talking about, the four of us, that sort of meta dialogue sense, the dialogue that unfolds between the dialogues, the dialogos that unfolds between all the individual dialogues. And so they have a tradition of how you're supposed to read through the dialogues. It's supposed to be it's not like our modern obsession with the historical lineage of the dialogues, but it's a developmental one. What's the best ordering, pedagogical, transformative ordering of the dialogues? So I'd like to try and do that as well. We'll see if my we'll see if my time and my resources and my energy match my ambitions. That's always an issue.
Well, Chris and I were talking about getting together and just reading through the Platonic Dialogues. And actually, I had this thought about it'd be interesting for like, say there's, you know, I don't know how many interlocutors, but have as many people, you know, just they take a character, and then actually like just taking your phone and going on a walk and doing it on a walk where you're somehow, and you kind of sit down and I just thought that would be really interesting to do.
Oh, that sounds like a very interesting idea. Yeah, that's a good idea. I know that Jonathan Miller at one point filmed a few of the dialogues. He actually turned them into little plays and actually filmed them.
Yeah.
But I haven't been able to track those down. Maybe they're on YouTube somewhere. I should look again.
Yeah.
As we get further and further into the age of YouTube, more and more things are findable on it that used to be very, very difficult to track down.
Oh, totally. I might sense the reading that I've done in the book that I have on sacred geometry. It's interesting. I've always been bad at math. The way that I was like, wow, if I would have read this book, right, and doing math, I think math would have occurred a lot differently.
I think it does, and it gives you a sense, and this is also why I'm very interested in it, because Neoplatonism is also deeply affected by a revival of Pythagorean thought, deeply. And Pythagoras is this weird figure, right? Because he's in one sense he's shamanic, but he's also this mathematical, I guess, genius or something.
Right.
And so I'm interested also in, because when you read text and it's all made out of numbers, we sort of go like, what that doesn't make any sense, because we think of numbers, right? If we don't think of the numerals, if we actually think of numbers, we just think of them as abstract sort of things.
Yeah.
But when all of math is geometry, numbers actually have a shape. They take up space in certain ways, right? Yeah. And they have these sort of almost synesthetic qualities to them that get connoted into the number. Yeah. And I know there's evidence that when people are engaged in mindfulness practices, that it tends to enhance synesthesia. So again, I don't know, but I'm wanting to explore it as well. Give me a sense of that Pythagorean understanding of number that was so important.
Right.
And then what does that do again for the practice of dialectic? What does that mean? Because if you can get, like, it feels like what you do with a mnemonic when you're trying to remember abstract information and you create these images to remember them. Like, will it act like a mnemonic enhancer when you have sort of sacred geometry? I don't know. These are a lot of things I want to sort of see. I want to explore.
Yeah, my sense in reading it. I want to do the practices too. I want to do and just that's my interest as well. Is get a sense, because I do get this sense in some intuitive way that I don't know how, but whatever it is that you exercise, it's like holding multiple dimensions at once and going back and forth, and that whole movement feels a lot like what I'm imagining it'll feel a lot like what it is to kind of be in a circling group, right? Room.
And people in the circling practices, so what I've observed is they often fall into sort of geometrical languages. At some point, they'll talk about intersections and viewpoints and perspectives and what they'll do is they'll spatialize it, as I'm doing with gesture. Yeah. Right, and there'll be all this gesturing that's going on. I think of geometry as something like that. Again, it's picking up on that place between gesture and proposition as well. Because of course, very often what we're doing when we're gesturing is we're doing this geometrical, like we're doing spatialization, but it's not just space. We're often figuring, and we're trying to figure, and we're trying to manipulate the figure as a way of, exploring intelligibility. And so, again, this is something I'm interested in, because I want to try and understand, like I said, you know, what could we use that could help us sort of reverse engineer these often really cryptic, maddeningly cryptic, and exciting statements that are made about dialectic when you read about it, because they talk about it as the greatest of the sciences, and and it's all this, and there's all this really like, and it's frustrating. It's so indirect, and I think that's not that they're being coy or they're being esoteric in the pejorative sense of the word. I think that dialectic was so pervasive and it's so permeated, right?
Yeah.
It was so close to them, like you often talk about the nearness, that like they can't get outside of it enough to talk about it to somebody that's outside of it the way we are.
Right.
And so, because there's lots sort of like there's lots of talk about it, but there's nothing that's like, well, this is how you do it, right? There's nothing that comes close to that. And so trying to reverse engineer it as best as we plausibly can, I think that's all we have.
Oh yeah.
That's what I'm part of it interested in. Because in the end, Guy, I am interested in it historically, but in the end, my interest is more as a cognitive scientist. I want to try and craft some kind of useful, not useless, what a slip, useful bridge between whatever that was, something that can act as a template for us now, in trying to craft, something analogous.
Yeah.
What Jordan calls the metapsychotechnology, what you sometimes call circling 2.0. You guys have different names for convergent things.
Yes.
That's what that's the project I'm ultimately more interested in.
Right.
So, I mean, I'll try my best to be as historically accurate, but I have no illusions that I'm going to get that close to the, like a confident historical claim, because the evidence is just too underdetermined. It's just too underdetermined.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think would be really interesting for us at some point is to look at, like, take one of the dialogoses that we're doing, and watch it together.
I would like to do that.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good idea. I want to do that. I want to figure out how to do that with software. I want to do that as part of the series. I want to take snippets of where we're doing things, of like pivotal moments, and use that and say, look what's happening here, look what's happening here.
Right.
I think having one of those, a meta one. The problem with us is we'll get into another. I see that we'll just start another dialogue, another Dialogos about right.
Right.
But maybe that'll be valuable too. But trying to, I would like, that would be good. But I'd like a little bit. I don't know what I want to say. A little bit cooler one where we're more analytic and more meta, and we're looking back and trying to note this and note that, and try to craft some vocabulary, and also try to apply some of the vocabulary that Chris and I have been working very hard to hammer out, and say, look, this here, this dimension here. Not trying to foreclose on anything, but to again try to facilitate the project I said to you. I want to try and help facilitate this shift that a lot of people are putting their finger on, about how we're trying to shift out of just theory into some kind of transformative practice. And a lot of people are talking about that right now. So that's what I would really like to address. So maybe we should do both. We should have one of the ones where we're just riffing, like just all of us on it, and then maybe a one where we're doing something more analytic, theoretic, because those would both be valuable. Anyways, that's I think that might be a good way of proceeding.
Because one of the things, I mean, and I think it will take some restraint on our part. But like, because watching them, and like I've watched them and tried to look at some of the patterns and stuff, and it's so interesting because, and this I think is telling of what it is, right? Is it's really difficult to not get pulled in to the conversation like you are in a movie.
Yeah. Yep.
Right?
Yep. That's why I was expressing that concern
Yeah.
to you. And I know many people say that. I was watching a really interesting discussion between Andrew Sweeney and Christopher Mastropietro,
Mhm.
and Andrew was pointing out how he gets a sense, and that same thing. He drawn in. He says that there's a lot of. He said that he could feel joy. There's a lot of joy
Mhm.
in the conversation, as opposed to adversarial processing.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that's what many people are commenting on.
Uh-huh.
It's I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because it's such an insufficient thing to say. I'm not criticizing Andrew. He was expressing something, but just saying there's joy there isn't quite right. There's something much more going on there, and it's hard to articulate what it is. But it is very attractive to people.
Yeah.
That I know.
Yeah.
That I'm getting a lot of feedback around that idea that it's very, very attractive
Right.
to people.
Right. If you look at a lot of the comments are just people, like you can feel the spirit of the conversation, and they overflow with like personal impact, but also their own ideas. Like, I mean, some comments are just so astute and profound.
Oh, very much. And there's often an expression of a desire to enter into this or to figure out how to do this with other people. And so that's part of, again, about why I want to have the one where we're not catching fire, because I want to know, like, I want to be able to say to people, well, this is, I mean, as much as we can, right? We have to be careful. I don't want to be idolatrous or anything, but as much as we can, this is how you do it, and this is what's going on, and
Totally.
right? So that's why I was expressing that concern about, like, trying to get. I think riffing on it is great, but I think that'll just be another level at which we're unfolding things. That's valuable, but also one where we're, like I said, a little bit more. No, let's try and get at the metaphor I use that some people don't like, but let's get at the machinery of what's going on here. Let's try and explicate that as best as we can, because I think that's part of what is going to be needed so that other people can enter in.
Yeah. Well, I know that I'm as we're talking, I'm referencing a lot in my mind and having memories of when the 7 stages of circling, which is what we teach in our course, started to articulate. And it was very much the process of, like, God, there's something really amazing happening here, but what is it? Like, and I remember we had our first 2 training courses, Jerry and I did, and the moment we had our first one and we got our students in front of us was the moment I realized I had no idea what I was, how, like,
right, yeah.
And so that process of, and it's a very difficult thing to do in my experience. It's like, because so much of it is about like a pre-reflective, attuned response.
Yes.
Right. Like this kind of that you go into flow states, right?
Very much.
But at the same time, there is this quality where you start to be able to make distinctions and notice more, right?
Yes.
And because you can notice them more, you can respond to them more precisely and more elegantly, right? That brings more on, and it had this kind of autopoetic process.
I think that's very helpful. So I'm maybe this will be helpful to you. I'm thinking about this in terms of 2 languages. I talk about this when in the stuff, the work on mindfulness. I sent you that chapter that Leo and I wrote on that. The language of training and the language of explaining, and I think we need both. So that trying to articulate a training language for people, but also trying to get a language of explaining that connects that training language to the cognitive science, because ultimately, for me, I want to situate this, like, back into the project, that we're talking about, which is responding to the meaning crisis. Right. So being able to resituate this deeply into, a cognitive scientific worldview.
Yeah.
It's part of the project for me. It's part of the project for me.
Oh yeah.
Because if we craft all this language and then it sits over here as a language that's disconnected from the scientific worldview, then we haven't really done what we need to do ultimately.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's the burden. That's the burden you're bearing.
Yeah. Well, I'm not bearing it totally alone. I mean, I've got. Christopher's helping me a lot, and Jordan has, he's got a science background too that he's bringing into the discussion. So that's very helpful as well.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what I'd like. I'd like to try. That's why doing the two riffs might be good.
Yeah.
Right? The first riffing, the right, that might help us sort of start drawing out a language of training. Maybe we could even frame it this way. We could we do an overview of one of our Dialogos, and we do it, and what we're trying to do there is the language of training, right?
Yeah. And
then we do an overview, and there we're trying to get more the language of explaining. And I understand, because of my training, I would have to take, a heavier burden there. I get that. But nevertheless, having everybody involved in that might be, like, we could frame it that way. So, like, do one around a language of training and one around a language of explaining.
Right. Like for example, I'm just imagining, like, for example, like the different kinds of love, right?
Yeah.
When you shift to one or the other and being able to spot that, right?
Yes, that would be good.
Mode of like, oh, we just went up a level, or we went more, right, lateral, and oh, we just went horizontal. Like,
that's great language of training. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Then I would try to say, okay, what does that in language of explaining? I might try and bring in and say, well, what's going on in terms of like attachment theory or development or the way cognitive acceptation is working? What's going on here? It's similar to like flow. I mean, so you have all this training language, but the work I did with Ariane and Leo, right? We're also trying to, okay, but what's going on? What's actually happening cognitively in flow?
Yeah.
Because if you understand what's happening cognitively, you can understand why these training practices are working, right? And you can improve them. Because that's ultimately what I want to do, right? Because I want to try and make this a practice of, with many other people's help, yours, especially. But I want to try and make this a practice of Philia Sophia.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not going to be Philia Sophia. You can't cultivate wisdom independent from your best knowledge system. That's just not going to work, right? Wisdom, it can't be reduced to knowledge. I mean, I've argued that in this series, but neither can it be. It can't be ghettoized from the best knowledge we have. Wisdom and knowledge have to inseminate each other in a very powerful way.
Right. Totally. And I would imagine the best that you can do is have the experience of it and then work out the constraints that give it. Right?
Well, that's what I'm trying to think of. I'm trying to think of, which is what you sort of do with flow. So you want to try and get nice. You want to get nice integration between the phenomenology and the functionality.
Yeah.
Right. So what the explaining should do is to ultimately tell you what's the function here, what's it doing, right? And then you want to see if you've got something that bridges between the phenomenology and the functionality in a powerful way. Like, why does shifting perspectives, which is a phenomenological thing, why does that have this functional impact of getting people to have an insight into their problems that they can't get while they stay in the first person perspective? We have sort of an intuitive sense of that, but what's actually going on, right? What's actually going on in the shift? I tried to do that. I tried to bridge between phenomenology and functionality when I gave the talk on the view from above, because and for me, I'm using that as sort of a template of, so what I was trying to do there is I was trying to zero in on a specific practice. And Donald Robinson actually took us through the view from above as a practice, and then say, okay, here's the phenomenology, and then here's the functionality, and try to keep those
Yeah.
talking together.
Yeah.
That's what I would like to do for
Yeah.
dialectic and dialogos. The
Right.
same kind of thing. So when people are doing this, when this shift is occurring, what what cognitive functionality is it, activating, and then why does that make sense, and so on and so forth.
Totally.
So, I mean, that's not something that's going to happen right away, and I don't even expect to have that answered by the end of After Socrates. But I want that's
Yeah.
the thing I want to start moving towards and get a rhythm of how
Yeah.
to move towards that.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you on
I
Yeah.
know you are. I know you are.
Totally.
And your accompaniment is deeply, deeply appreciated. Like I said, when Chris and I were working today on the chapter on the four kinds of knowing and dialectic, here, let me give you an example. Let me
Yeah.
give you an example of what I mean. So we were talking about this, and I said, oh, there's a connection between dialectic and prospect refuge theory. And he said, well, what's that? Well, this is a theory, right, that we like situations in which we have a vista before us,
Yeah.
but we also feel safe. Prospect and refuge. It's also known as a womb with a view. Now you can see why that would be something that would really enhance our optimal grip, because we're relatively safe from predation, and we can see opportunities, right? And then I said, notice, and then I was saying to Chris, I said, notice how Guy constantly will bring us back to the relationship between the horizon and the ground.
Yeah.
The ground is where we're getting a secure footing.
Yeah.
But right, that's the refuge,
Right.
and yet we're being put into the prospect of the horizon continually. And then when we talked about how that maps onto these different aspects of the sacred, like the homing and the numinous, see, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We're trying to get between, like, the language that you bring out, right? You bring out that language of the horizon and the ground, right? But then you can link that to, well, prospect and refuge theory and an evolutionary functionality. And, but, oh, right. And if that's what people are looking for, then how can we better tailor the practice to afford that?
Yeah.
See, that's an example. That's a concrete example of what I'm talking about.
Totally. Totally. That's really cool. That's really, really cool. Yeah. Yeah. There's something about this back and forth thing that, like it's almost like, I guess in very much in many ways, I think about the thing that you guys talk about, and I've heard you talk about addiction, right? It's almost the reverse of that back and forth, or the reverse.
Yeah, I call it reciprocal narrowing as opposed to reciprocal opening.
Exactly.
We're bringing that into the chapter, right? It's because we're trying to get, right, the horizontal sensibility transcendence unpacked in terms of, anagoge, which can be unpacked in terms of reciprocal opening as opposed to reciprocal narrowing. And then you've got all the machinery, all the excellent work that Mark Lewis has done, telling you how reciprocal narrowing works, and then that gives you just, that gives you some understanding of how the reciprocal open. That's another example of how you can do all this bridging. And see, addiction is great. Sorry, the topic of addiction is great. Addiction is horrible for people. I shouldn't talk so cavalier about such a devastating topic. I apologize to anybody to whom an apology is owed. But see how, if you really want to understand addiction, you can't just stay in the phenomenology.
Yeah.
Right. You can't ignore the phenomenology, because then you'll just be prescribing other drugs. So Mark's work is brilliant because it bridges between the phenomenology and the functionality.
Okay. Totally got it. Right.
Because if you can take the phenomenology and then do what he does, he says, no, the phenomenology is not well described by the disease metaphor. Let's describe it with this reciprocal narrowing. And then once you do that, you can connect it up to all of these self-organizing developmental aspects of cognitive processing, which is what he does.
Yeah. So addiction's almost like kind of a dyslexic form of enlightening.
Kind of. It's kind of, for me, it's an instance of the very machinery that can lead to self-transcendence, is the machinery that can afford deep self-deception.
Right. The thing I've been paying attention to a lot lately is, so I think one of the cool things about what this also affords, right? Breaking everything down like this and looking at all the ways that we're describing is, it's like once we get a description of the phenom, like some aspect of it, say it's like,
Yeah.
the transition from like agape to philia and back and
Yeah.
forth, right? Let's just
Yes.
say
Yes.
we can
Yeah.
we can start to tell the difference and then describe what happens, and then what you yes.
Chris and I were talking about just that,
Uh-huh.
because we were talking about. I was wondering if, right, if one of the things we're doing. See, so we're talking a lot about eros, this
Yeah.
attractive element in Dialogos, right? That Socrates talks about.
Yeah.
But it's also bound up with midwifery, and that this is like very close to getting to agape, because you're trying to help people to give birth to
Right.
their aspirational selves, right?
Right.
But I was saying, there's a potential. I'm not making an identity claim here. I'm talking about a potential. There's a potential for eros to degenerate where the need for consummation can degenerate into consumption.
Yep.
Right. And eros can degenerate into lust. And, this is an ancient worry. And I said, I wonder if the attempt to move to agape, right, is an attempt to always forestall eros degenerating into lust, because you can see philia Nikeia as the lust for victory in conversation, as opposed to the philia pursuit of wisdom, or the agapic midwifery of people's aspirational selves.
Yeah.
So that language of the loves and the way they might feature in, as you said, the constraints on dialectical practice.
Right.
I think that's germane. I think that's very germane.
And it's like, and then if we get those kind of phenomenologically distinct and they're able to see them,
yes,
and then we go over to this side and we start to look at the cog side and we look at the machinery,
yes,
right, and start linking that up. What's cool about that is then we have something that where you can actually take an aspect of it and then make it its own practice.
yes,
Just
very much.
exercise that particular muscle, right, and feel into it.
It's very much like some of the work I'm doing with Jun-Sun Kim on that. We're working on a paper on a naturalistic explanation of chi.
Yeah.
And so we're doing exactly that. We're trying to very carefully move between the phenomenology and the functionality, and exactly that. As you get a better understanding of that bridge, that enhanced language of explaining and the way it bridges to the phenomenology, then enhances your capacity to train. It just enhances your capacity to train, because, like you said, the problem with the phenomenology is it often hits you as a gestalt, right?
Yeah.
A dialectical self, a dialectic. No, I don't want to say dialectical. I want to say a dynamical, because we're talking about dialectic. That's why I got snagged. It strikes you as a dynamical gestalt. And, it's all at once and it's moving.
Yeah.
Right. And it's very, very hard. When I teach Tai Chi to people, it's very hard to intervene in that. That's why there's like two levels of learning, like really knowing the form well, insofar as I know it. It is, I've been doing it 28 years. So, but that's radically insufficient for teaching it.
Yeah.
Because typically what happens is, if you can't step back and do this kind of translation and analysis, what you just keep doing is demonstrating the gestalt to the people right around you, and that's not useless, but that it's very, very hard for them to self-correct.
That's point.
To get an access to know how to correct themselves, right? It's very hard, because it's like, well, no, that's not right, and like, well, why? What should I do? Well, do this. And, well, I tried to do that. Like you get those that you right, and you got to try and like get something, like you said, that can take a piece out and make it independently intelligible and accessible to people. I agree with that. I think that's very pertinent.
That's a kind of like like when you go and do circling, do you guys ever like kind of start off by doing those like line exercises where you face somebody? And
we do. Well, for the first 3 or 4 sessions, can't remember how many we've done now. They've been truly wonderful. Thank you so much. Just amazing,
Hmm.
really transformative. That's also now what I consider part of my practice.
Yeah.
We did some of those initially, I think for 2 or 3 sessions, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And then, but what happened is, because there's only, what, 7 of us,
Mhm.
and we've started meeting regularly, we can now just, it's like when you meet your cousin that you haven't seen for 10 years and you could just
Yeah.
like pick
Yeah.
up, right? So now the other day, one of the people, Taylor, he brought in an issue that we were not taking into the circling. We were discussing it. It was fraught with a little bit of, not tension around the group, but tension around the ideas that were being discussed. And so we didn't immediately just start circling. We went into the mutual noticing kind of practices in order to warm up again, to get back into it. Yeah,
Yeah.
very much.
Because those were actually, we abstracted those out as a way
I
of
thought so.
basically taking particular muscles, like where there's one where all you can do is just paraphrase what the person says.
Yep, yeah,
Right?
I've done it. Yeah,
You stick through it, you stick through it, you stick through it, right? And then this is the one that I find just fascinating, is the one where you basically, you sit across from somebody. It's really simple. You just say, like, being with you right now, I'm noticing. And
yeah,
like, and the practice is to really just speak slow enough such that, like, you're actually describing what's happening, such that if what you're describing changes, you can adjust, right? And then the other person says, hearing that, being with you right now, I'm noticing.
I've done that practice a few times too, and I understand what you're saying there. And I had a suspicion that they're not just warm-ups, that they're componential, they're components.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about now.
Yeah.
So I'm also interested in, like I said, Peter and I have been talking about this, Peter Lindbergh, about sort of ordering a lot of these practices in sort of a pedagogical program. Because they do once we get a clear understanding, this is another thing the analysis will help, and I think this is what your point is. If we get a better understanding of a componential analysis of the whole thing, right, we can get a better understanding of a program, of how to set these practices in an order that will sort of give us the best momentum into the overall thing.
Kind of like the dialogues, right?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly no, it's exactly analogous. That was in my mind as and so that's been something that Peter and I have been sort of thinking about, like, where would you put, something like the anti-debate or insight dialogue, or the empathy circling. Like, they seem to be putting different emphasis, I'll use your metaphor, on different muscles, and how could we put them together and then lead into what you call circling 1.0 perhaps, and then and then what could we do to bootstrap that into into dialectic? That's what I'm really interested in.
Total. There's I talked with Porcelli, who he helped run the Integral Institute in Colorado when it was existing, and he's been talking, actually I didn't know this, but he's been talking with Jordan every other month or so. He lives down in San Diego, and with what's the other guy's name who does the War on Sense Making?
Daniel Schmachtenberg.
And he just had mentioned that they've been talking about, they kind of have a vision of like some kind of thing where it's like a 3-tiered. They made these distinctions where it's like there's one practice where it's just purely like the in the moment, like personal, right, circling stuff, and then but how do you transition from that into like doing stuff, right? Like like implementing stuff, right? And he said that the stuff that we're doing is like the center, right, of where you start to generate the ideas and work them out, and then how do you go from that with a cohesiveness all the way through to a space of where you go and kick ass, right? You go and like
I think that's well said. That's a really difficult problem. I mean, and that goes towards Paul's issue about scalability.
Almost every corporation that ever existed, or any kind of group of
Yeah.
people to get anything done, like it's a huge problem.
It is. And like I said, I'm again, we've got some cognitive science of distributed cognition, trying to bring that in. We understand, network formations better than we've ever had in the past. So we have some new tools we can bring to bear on this. We can, like Jordan has suggested in the dialogue I had with him on the religion that's not a religion, we can supplement and complement the interpersonal process with, AI data analysis of things that we can't process because of the sort of the number crunching involved.
Yeah.
So we have some tools to bring to bear on that problem. You put your finger on the scalability problem.
Yeah.
The thing that gives me a bit more hope than perhaps Paul Vanderklay, is there's a sense in which, and there's a danger in this, and I bring out the danger in this series, but there's a sense in which really good ideas and practices self-scale. They sort of self-organize. Because it struck, I remember I was talking about this, who was I talking to about this? And I said, the way Freud's ideas have permeated through the culture, and we now take it as second nature, or even, some of Descartes' ideas. Like there's a degree to which, I don't want to invoke too much of Richard Dawkins here, but there's a degree to which these ideas have like a mimetic capacity, to sort of replicate themselves and evolve their own scalability, to a degree. And I think that's as it should be, if I'm allowed to pronounce on that, precisely because that, that's the logos, right? That's part of the logos. Its ability to its own generativity, its ability independent of us, whoever us is, like to evolve and permeate itself in some way that's not in our hands. So I'm hoping that will also be a factor for us.
I'm wondering, I just had this thought about that thing that evolves itself, right?
Yes.
Independent from us in some way, that we can look back. I think it's that thing that where when you look back, it all looks like a plan, right?
Yeah.
But
Kierkegaard talked about that.
Thing of like this, it's a straight path when you're looking back, but as you're going forward, you can't see the pattern. You're so in it.
Well, that part of it is right. Part of it is when you look forward, you're facing combinatorial explosion. When you look back, all the relevance realization has been done. So it looks like it was what Kierkegaard something said, like when we look forward, we see freedom, and when we look backwards, we see destiny. Right. It's something along those lines. And it's like, why is that? Well, because this is combinatorial explosive, and there, all the relevance realization has all been done, right? And so there is that asymmetry there.
And so there's this is combinatorial explosive. However, somehow it's in some way that we can even think we're doing. In fact, we can think we're doing the opposite, right?
Yes.
Of what it ends up being, and it ends up doing all the right things.
This goes towards your point about, like, in the end, dialectic is it's a virtual engineering. We're trying to set up, probably a somewhat complex and dynamic set of constraints to afford something that ultimately has to be a logos. It has to be a gathering of it to to itself, from itself, kind of thing. Yes, very much. So I'm trying to I'm reading through. I'm trying to integrate Slingerland's ideas from the book Trying Not to Try, because he argues that in the East, especially in Taoism, branches of Buddhism and Zen, this issue about trying not to try, about how to, which is, I think, the central problem about participation, is like, how do you balance, Tanabe talks about this in Metanoetics. He talks about tairiki and jairiki, self-power and other power. How do you balance those together so that you're genuinely participating in a self-organizing system that has some life of its own, right?
Right.
And you see that it's interesting because you don't see that becoming a focal philosophical problem so much in the West, perhaps perhaps with Heidegger, it comes to the fore. But it's a perennial, or at least long-standing philosophical problem in Asian philosophy.
Yeah. Is it in it? Now I was going to ask so it's been difficult for me to really grasp what Heidegger talks about as historicity, right?
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if this is kind of gets at it a little bit of that, which is like there's a, you know, in his view is like, well, what, you know, how do we, to understand the current ontotheology or understanding of being, right? You can go back, how you do it is you go back and you look at the ways in which it was understood differently.
Yes.
And what's interesting is like when he excavates that understanding from the different epochs of history, like with Kant and then, you know, Aristotle and Plato and this pre-Socratics, this is where it's really interesting just as an exercise to do that. And what that exercise is just to excavate this, but that it's not like you're hearing Aristotle or Kant talk about their understanding of being. In fact, you may even hear them talk about their understanding of being. But where he seems to kind of go is he somehow unconceals that by virtue of which they would say this about being, right?
Yeah.
Like it's way back there, right? The primordial pre-thematic understanding, such that everything that they're saying both conceals but reveals. And I'm wondering if like that, in that sense of destiny, right? And that it has its own movement, right? It is.
So I think that there's a couple of things I would want to say in response to that. I mean, so I take the Heidegger and I sort of inflect it with Wittgenstein, and I sort of, and you can see that in the series because I try to get at this notion of an evolving grammar, cognitive cultural grammar. And that's how I try to make sense of that and how that is really much, you know, vectoring how the relevance realization process is unfolding.
Right. Actually,
there's that
term. I love that term. You use that, grammaring, the cultural grammar.
Yeah. So that's how I've tried to do it. I've tried to integrate because there, I mean, a lot of people have noted this. There's some deep convergences between Wittgenstein and Heidegger on this sort of stuff. And when I'm trying to get at participatory knowing, I'm sort of drawing on both of them towards that. So there's that. And then the sense of destiny. See, so I have, like I said, I'm going to formulate it as a question because that's the most appropriate representation of how it's situating in my mind right now. Yeah. Is that an illusion? Right. Because when we look back, the relevance realization has occurred, and contrastively, when we look forward, it's open. It's like we're facing a combinatorially explosive future. Yeah. Because I'm trying to get a sense of, well, let's do one of the pre-Socratics because Chris mentioned this. Chris mentioned this with Andrusini. You know, Heraclitus, the character is destiny. And that characterization, Chris does this riff on it where he says, well, that means characterization is destination. And then I'm trying to think, but is it that the right way to think about it, right? Because for me, I guess what I'm trying to get is too unidirectional.
Yeah, totally.
I'm very sensitive to Eggs-Callard's point about the problem of self-transcendence, or what she calls self-creation, right? If it just totally overtakes me from outside as some external force, right, then I've lost myself. It's not self-transcendence. And if I totally make it happen and cause it to happen, then there's no self-transcendence because there's nothing that's being created or new. Right? And I think it was Strawson who said, well, that means that self-transcendence, self-creation is actually impossible.
Right.
And then she says, no. Aspiration actually is the process in which people do this. And as I tried to argue, I think aspiration is deeply linked to participatory knowing, which is deeply linked to the sacred second self, right? And all of that stuff. And so that's kind of why I want to challenge what I'm calling, or at least I want to call into question. That's because that's how I framed it.
Right.
This idea of a destiny. I think we definitely have the phenomenological sense of that. Yeah. But is that sense reflective of the process that we're participating in, or is it actually a skewing of that because we have this contrast between the open future and the completely intelligible past, right? I'm picking up on a Kierkegaardian theme here.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that you're saying that that sense of destiny, the sense of, right, is what it's the way it somehow constitutes maybe the way I participate with the unfolding?
It is, but I'm wondering if it's irreplaceable. That's what I'm trying to bring out. I'm trying to bring out, because the issue with the destinying is because it can slip into a kind of unilateral teleology, a unidirectional teleology. I think it actually obscures the problem rather than addressing it. The problem that and it seems impossible. It seems like it's almost like, again, a pre-Socratic, paradox here. It sounds like something out of Parmenides. Right. If I create other than myself, then I'm not self-creation, right? Yeah. But if I only make it and I'm complete author, then there is no creation. There's only repetition. And so how can, right? And so I feel that let me just call it this pro tem, the illusion of being destined actually obscures a problem that existentially and philosophically needs to be resolved. That's my concern. Right,
totally. Yeah, is it irreplaceable? Yeah, because there is this sense of, I would imagine it gets like the epitome of it is the flow state,
well, that's it. The flow state is very much one in which I think a lot of these dichotomies to break down in an important way. Because the thing about the flow state is, again, that's why it's so exemplary of, the perspectival really being really deeply aligned with the participatory, because the self-organization is so foregrounded rather than backgrounded. The sense of being the author or just the recipient, they're basically marginalized by how foregrounded the flow is, hence the name, right? The flow gets foregrounded. And the thing about the flow is it pushes against these ideas of authorship from within or destinying from without or things like that. And again, that's why I often, when I'm in discussion with, Jonathan Pajot or Paul Vanderklay, and they bring up sort of, the teleological things, I'll say, well, in things like Taoism, you don't have this kind of teleological drive. And you don't see the universe in terms of a cosmic story. It's almost pre-axial in some ways. You see it as these huge self-organizing systems.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a fundamentally different way. And so I'm interested in the degree to which human beings can go sort of trans or post-narrative and get out of being bound to that illusion of destiny in their self-interpretive, self-transcending projects.
Yeah, totally. Oh, totally. Now, and when we say purpose, right? Because I know that there's lots of it's a really big buzzword.
Yeah, it is.
Right now,
it's not as important to meaning as life as we thought.
Oh, really?
Mattering. Sorry, I was going to say mattering matters more. But I think this really came out in Susan Wolf's book, like experience, feeling. I want to use the word sensing to mean both perceiving and having an understanding of, like, right? Sensing that you are relevant to others,
Yeah.
and that you make a difference to others and to something beyond yourself.
Yeah.
That seems to be one of the central things. That's what some of the most recent work on meaning in life is showing.
Right.
That connectedness. And there's two ways. We need to feel that, if you'll allow me again the geometry.
Yes.
We need to feel that people are vectored towards us in care. But we also, right, so we need that connectedness, but we also need to matter. We need to feel that what we do is relevant to others and to the world at large.
Yeah, totally. And
Now,
and we know, so I can get how purpose
can obscure that. Yeah, it can.
Right. Well, it could also gather it, right?
It could gather it. So, and I want to be clear, purpose does seem to matter to meaning in life. It does make a difference. But what I'm arguing against is the idea that we can reduce meaning in life to purpose.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's the obscuring of the intelligibility, the connectedness, and the mattering by purpose that that concerns me. And I was trying to address that in some of the final episodes of the series when I was trying to get into Heidegger, right? And the rose blooms without a why.
Yeah.
Right?
By the way, those last those last three you did on Heidegger, I was so impressed by how you basically took Heidegger and figured out how to make it available in such a short a period of time, right?
Well, thank you. That was a hard task.
It's like a difficult feat, I would admit, like in precisely in what not to talk about, right?
Yes, that was the hardest problem.
Yeah.
That was the hardest problem.
Yeah.
So I made the decision that the bridge through Dreyfus between Heidegger and Cog-Sci was the most pertinent to the overall argument of the series. So that's how I made the choice.
Right. Yeah, just you got it and you held it and just linked everything through that, right? And even with Corbin, and I mean Corbin is so obscure, right?
Yeah.
To people.
I'm going to be talking with Thomas Chetham. I'm going to be talking with him. Yeah, we're going to do a video thing and probably record it. Yeah, so somebody reached out who was sort of a student of him and was watching my series and said, you two should talk. And so, we're going to have a discussion sometime in January about Corbin.
It's somebody that's worked with Corbin?
It's the person whose work I cited a lot. Chetham, the book, he wrote the book, like The World Turned Inside Out. I think it's Imagine a Love, All the World, an Icon. That set of books on Corbin, which is, I highly recommend his work as the way of getting into Corbin so that you can start to, get a sense of what's really happening in Corbin, rather than the problem with Corbin, right, is this beautiful lyricism, but it can keep you sort of outside of the movement of his thought. Right. Yeah, that's stuff. But Chetham is like he's got this perspicacious access providing.
Because I got in contact with Corbin first when I think I went right after I graduated high school through James Hillman.
Yeah, I've read. Yeah,
psychology. I was like, that was a whole period I went through of like diving into that.
Yeah, Chetham talks about that, and he talks about, which I tried to touch on. He talks about the relationship between Corbin and Hillman. It's especially in the book on Imaginal Love, that because Hillman figures much more largely in that. The connection between Corbin and Hillman also comes out in Avin's book, The New Gnosis. But Chetham also discusses also the Corbin-Jung connection too, because that's relevant to Hillman as well.
Totally. With the archetypal psychology stuff, that at least when I didn't notice it back then. Anyways, maybe I could see it now, but I don't get the sense that they excavated the Heidegger connection much out of, right?
There's not as much as they should have. So part of what I was trying to do was use Corbin as a way of doing that. Use the Heidegger-Corbin-Jung connection,
Yeah.
and also the Heidegger-Tillich connection, and then the Tillich-Jung connection.
Right.
I was trying to constellate around Jung.
Yeah.
And that's also why I did we just uploaded the dialogue with Anderson Todd about Jung.
Yeah. Because I liked the thing that I liked how you highlighted the danger with Jung. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like it depends on where you're coming from. Like you could read Jung and from a certain perspective and get something really like
no, that's
romantic kind of.
You can
hear it, like, right?
You can. That's definitely the case. I didn't get to talk a bit about Wilber's critique about Jung, the pre-trans fallacy. I think that's an important thing too that needs to be discussed. Yeah, there is that sort of danger. I think that's the right word. Trying to get all those guys like sort of talking to each other and then talking with the argument of the course. That was kind of an exhilarating challenge, trying to figure out how try to get them to all talk to each other and sort of what are the possible connections that would help help other people gain access. Because I try to present them, like I said, as a consolation, the prophets of the meaning crisis, and that it's best to understand them in that fashion rather than seeing them as isolated figures.
Right.
And plus, I mean, that's part again why I had the discussion with Anderson. I would like to bring Jung back into discussion rather than just like just I don't know what just being venerated. I don't want to be too harsh here, but that's part of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
So I mean that's what and Anderson and I talked about this a bit, but that's why I talked about it also in the series. Buber's critique of Jung, which is part of the danger that you're pointing out. Like there's a sense in which the intrapsychic can become so captivating that you lose the existential in a powerful way.
Yeah.
And that's part of Tillich's critique too. Now Anderson argued, I think quite cogently, that that is not correct of Jung towards the end. That towards the end of his development and his thinking, right, it becomes progressively much more transjective and existential, and not just intrapsychic. As you move into the later Jung. So Anderson Anderson Todd, like he made a very good point about that. He also did a very good criticism of my take on Jung and the divine double, which I thought was correct. So that was some good self-correction.
What was the correction? I haven't watched it yet.
Okay, so in the series, I talk about the divine double because we need the inactive symbol in order to afford aspiration, because prolective rationality is constitutive of rationality. I think that I like that argument. I think it's a good argument. But I thought that the divine doubling was between the ego and the self. That's actually a mistake. What Anderson pointed out was no, right? The divine double is actually the anima or the animus, right? It's because the divine double has to actually stand. It has to mediate between you and the self, between the ego and the self. And if you think about it, that actually maps onto the divine double better, because the divine double is actually between you, right? In the Gnostic, it's between you and God, right? And the ultimate, right? And so it's like, if you'd allow me the language, the soul, right, looks towards you and calls you, right? But it's also being called forward, right? And so you're both moving together. So that's why, right, the divine double is, right? Well, it's a sacred second self. It's right, but it's sacred in that it's not only affording your aspiration, it's doing what we talked about, Guy. It's giving you a place to stand, but it's also prospecting you towards what it's a symbol for itself.
Right.
So it's this interesting thing, right? You're enacting a symbolic relationship with the sacred second self, but
Right.
it itself is in a symbolic relationship, right, to the fount of intelligibility.
Right. And it's transparent,
Yeah, or
right?
translucent at least.
Translucent, right? Oh, that's amazing.
So I thought that was an excellent critique. So that's afforded some self-criticism, like of my take on Jung. I thought that was, oh yeah, I thought that was a very germane criticism that he made.
Right. Totally. Totally. I appreciate your what you said about I found myself sunk into the experience or imagining the experience. And when you talked about getting them all talking to each other,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Like that I would imagine. I'm really curious to like we should just like make sure that we do the sacred geometry around the same time so we can talk about our about it. But I have a feeling
I would like that. That would be helpful to me. Thank you.
like it's like because some of the questions I've had is wondered about when you talk about like when I'm working on this project with somebody, right? Like with Chris and with the different people with Leo. What does that look like? Like when you like you go over to each other's house, do you like brew coffee? Do you drink beer? Do you write emails? Like are you in discussions like this?
It's mostly, I mean, so when I work with Chris or Leo or Anderson, they usually come to my place, my apartment, and we hang out. Usually we need to set aside a big chunk of time.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so we often talk about it as a marathon session, like 4 or 5 hours, and then it's sometimes you're writing, sometimes like you're actually generating text, but sometimes you pull away from the text and you enter into discussion and reflection. I'm often sort of pacing around the room. Although that's with Chris or Anderson. Although with Leo, it tends to be a little bit reversed, except when we're writing, usually Leo's at the computer, but in the initial stages, I'll usually be in a chair and Leo is pacing around very dynamically. But when we sit to write, then usually Leo's actually at the computer, and then we switch roles. And there again, there's something about, it's the peripatetic thing, the walking around, the inactive movement is somehow integral. I mean, that's what the Stoa was the place where the Stoics literally walked back and forth, right? And so there's all of that going on typically. And then then there's usually it gets taken back into some text, and then you do the more analytic reflection on the text, and you come back together to do the project. You write differently with different people.
Really bonded, don't you, with the people that you work with?
Oh, very much. I mean,
it's so immersive in so many ways, and I bet like the relationship that you end up building is just really, really rich.
It is, and they're different because you work differently with different people. So, like for example, when I'm working with Leo, we'll tend to sort of sentence by sentence construction, whereas with Chris, well, you've seen it. Chris has a lyricism that you don't want. You don't want to, Blake. You don't want to crush the butterfly, right? So typically, what happens is Chris and I get together and we'll write the argument, and I'll usually play the leading role there. But then he goes away, and when he comes back, there's all this text that's so rich with his lyricism and the poesis, right? And then we read through it together and sort of edit and riff on it. So
interesting. So
you have to adjust. Sorry, I interrupted you. You have to adjust to the person you're working with.
Yeah. So there's the geometry again.
Exactly.
Yeah. it's so interesting to look at just what that what is the difference that how do we know to be different with each other in that way, right? Like,
That's very, very interesting. And
what are we tuned into in responding differently to different people? That's one of the things I've
yeah, that's a good question. It's the way, I mean, part of it is, you think about planning and all that tacit stuff, all those patterns that we're picking up tacitly. There's that. Um, there's something about, sorry, this is very gestural. There's something about the way you get the alignment, the alignment between the kinds of knowing within you.
Yeah.
And when that's working and the other person seems to feel that working, then whatever it is that you've been doing between you, that's got, Chris and I are talking about this in the dialectic, right? Like you're trying to do the sensibility transcendence. You're trying to fit yourself to the other person horizontally, but that's always in interplay. And I use that word deliberately. That's always in interplay with this vertical alignment between the kinds of knowing. So you're getting the deep understanding within that's interpenetrating with the deep understanding without. And those two are sort of playing off against each other for me. So you sort of play around with different ways in which you sort of reconfigure yourself. And then when you get, for me, when you get that sort of phenomenological sense of, oh, wow, there's the inner alignment, and he or she seems to be now glowing, right? And then that's how, and then what you start to do is you start to tack on that. You start to get the sense of, okay, keep finding that. Okay, how do I get back? Now I can go over to here. Oh, that's too far. That's breaking something. You get back, and you get like, it's like almost like a martial art. You're getting like, what's the space in which I can move around with this person and maintain that vertical horizontal integration.
Right. Got that. Just to think about just that sense of, like, in some way we're doing that without even having to know that we're doing that, right?
I don't think we can do it totally in a knowing fashion. I think it permeates and impregnates our capacity for knowing. This is part of what Plato is trying to articulate with the mythos of recollection, right? If you don't have this already operating in you, then you can't recognize it.
Right.
You can't recognize it.
Wow, it's so interesting. Because I think about that sometimes with, with doing these, because when we just started off doing circling, we would do these 2 to 3 day courses every couple of months or so. And then when I started training people, right, inside of like a year-long container, that was a totally, it's not, and it goes beyond just the fact that we had more time together.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
There's something that goes on that seems to be more developmental, right? Whereas a weekend course, you can witness like transformation. You can witness people having like a deep perspective shift, right? However, in the year long, there's something about, like, I often think about that. There's some teacher. There's a teacher that no one is anonymous through the whole thing, right?
Oh, well, we talk about this explicitly, like in Tai Chi Chuan. I tell people that you'll have an external teacher, me, that will help to give birth to the internal teacher that eventually will make me obsolete. That kind of thing. And of course, it's again this weird paradox of self-creation. You can't make the teacher. Right, but you can't just receive the teacher either. Neither one of those will work. I think part of it, like, I have a similar experience when I get to teach people over years, and part of it is if you've entered into a more academically appropriate kind of intimacy with them. I want to use my words carefully here, right? But if you do that, what happens is, I think you get what we've been talking about. You don't just witness their transformation permeates into you, and you, the way you know yourself is being changed in the way you're knowing them.
Yeah.
And that's part of the difference there, right?
Yeah. So it's in a certain sense, there's a way where I often think about that, like in some ways, you know, the content of what, like we'll be up there teaching something, let's say, right? So on one level, like what we're teaching is they're learning it, right? Frontal.
Yeah.
But there's this other way in which the way that they're sitting, the distance between each other, the values that even have anybody like come together like that somehow organize in the background, right?
Well,
Everything that we're doing, that deep participation with each other in all these ways that are auto-poetic and self-creating, right? In that way, is the same kind of thing. It's like you walk out with an accent that you didn't.
Yes. That's well put. I like that metaphor. That's exactly right. Or a bit of a dialect even. But there's some play on word between dialect and dialectical here, but you definitely have that's a good way of putting it. I mean, part of it is human beings are terrific.
There's something about mimicking there too.
I think because there's imitation,
right?
There's reciprocal imitation, there's reciprocal internalization going on. And then when we internalize somebody, we inhabit our mind and body differently, so then we inhabit the world differently, and there's all that habitus ontus change. And then of course there's also the issue that, you know, human beings are terrifically complex,
right?
And when systems are very complex, it takes a lot of time, right, in many dimensions before you can get at the deeper, more hidden variables behind what they're doing. That just takes a lot of time. Right. I think about, like, if you were trying to figure out how a jungle was operating, right? Like if you spent a weekend with a jungle, how well are you going? You've got to walk through the jungle, and you've got to go to different places in the jungle. You've got to move around, and like it's like getting the diversity and the amount of data you need in order to get at the deeper variables. That just takes a lot of time and a lot of difference.
Totally. And then and that's why I'm kind of like that's why I don't think I can really, I mean, I still do some weekend courses and stuff, right? But the ones that are just so satisfying are those watching somebody through a year, right?
No, I think that's right.
Where I first noticed that difference, right, was I think it may have something to do with that difference between transformation and development, right? Like I was sitting, I think it was the last course of the first year that I was doing this, and I was sitting up on it was like in a loft kind of space, and we were on a break, and I'm just sitting relaxing on the stairwell, and I'm just kind of just watching people just intermingle. And it's interesting because I just started to tune in to how, like, somebody and how they were just responding to somebody else, right? And just kind of just watching the way that all their micro movements and their responses, like their immediacy, how they were in the immediate sense. And I started thinking about, like, well, what did they come here for, right? And in so many cases, I was like, oh my God, like they've not only have they not gotten what they came for, but they've gotten it in such a way that they don't even notice that they're responding completely differently.
Right. No.
Like they could recognize it if you point it out, right? And then they can see it. But I could tell in the pre-reflective, immediate sense of how the world showed up for them over that period of time. And I was like, I have a feeling that's something like development. Right?
It is, and I think. Well, I think it's like, you know, how you develop a taste in the old sense of the word. like the taste for classical music. We talked about this, the three senses of appreciation.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's how that works is, well, I mean, it's one of the central issues for both development and trying to understand aspiration.
Yeah.
But like it's intriguing how people, like how they it's like what narrative does and how we become temporally extended agents, right? Aspiration does something similar, but it's like it's not temporally extended. I don't know what the dimension is, but we what's intriguing to me is how people extend their identity into what they've become, right? Because of course, there's lots of times when change is forced upon us and we don't extend our identity into that. We get an illness and like, oh, right, like I don't identify with my illness or something like that. But like, how do people do this? Is like trying to get it to think about? I often do the cognitive scientist. Like, what would I do? How can I get a machine to go through self-transcendence and do this weird thing where it established a non-logical identity between its current self and the self that it transcended?
Yeah.
Such that it could say with conviction, I have gone through development. I have developed and transcended my previous, who I was before.
Yeah.
And that rather than experience it as some logical chaos, they like narrative allows us to do that, again, in ways that are kind of still obscure. Like the way we can point to a picture of a 1-year-old and say, there I am, like, which is just a bizarre thing. And we take it as second nature because of the way we practice with narrative so much. And I think there's something similar to aspiration, the way, right, when people are going through this process and they become like, it's like that person is, right, it's not only that he or she is in a pre-reflective state, but I would say, right, their identity is already growing beyond their self-authorship.
Yeah.
And that's the process.
On their self-authorship. Yes.
That's what really, really intrigues me. It reminds me of where Ricoeur talks about temptation and the symbolism of evil. He says, we feel like we're being tempted by something other than ourselves. And this goes back to the Kierkegaardian thing. But once we give into the temptation, we feel that we tempted ourselves. Like it's this weird, this weird there's, right? And somehow our identity extends in ways outside of our ego self-authoring in this really interesting way. And because what he or she was doing, right, is she was extending identity and internalizing, not in any way that was being done deliberatively or, like I say, in a self-authoring fashion, but her identity is absorbing and extending. And then she's going to discover how her identity, or I think you said it was her, grew. But what does that mean? That's such
that's like, I know, it's like, it makes me like have chills or something. Yeah. And how does it, like, what is the intelligibility that self-organized itself in that way? Like,
yes.
Like,
There's something
so much about stuff that's like the way the machinery, what's possible with the machinery. It's like,
there's so much. I mean, that's what I spent so much time trying to unpack as much of the machinery as I could in the series to try and give us as many, and I never have made claims of it being sort of exhaustive or anything like that. Just because I think we need all the tools we can bring to bear on that issue. The question that it verges on a mystery of what's actually affording, what's affording and what's going on in self-transcendence. The self-transcendence that's so essential to overcoming self-deception and so essential to mattering, right? And right, like that has always deeply intrigued me right from the very beginning. When I was reading Plato and Nietzsche in first-year university, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I mean, I was like, that issue has always like, it's like, I feel, I hope that I've helped to elucidate that issue
Yeah.
a lot, I hope, but
Yeah.
I don't feel that well, there's no way in which it's comprehensive or complete or anything like that. But that capacity for, like I say, that we reach beyond ourselves, but we don't, to call ourselves, but we don't, to become ourselves who we weren't, right? It's like,
Totally. Totally. And that there's a quality of, there's an element of that we kind of arrive here with that going on,
yes,
right?
yes,
Like the intelligence, the
yeah,
intelligibility expressed in that. It's just so, it's almost it's so wondrous and so mysterious, it almost hurts.
yes,
Right?
yeah. So part of the
I just want to say, I just really felt like there was a moment right there where I just felt, where you're just like, what is this? And I felt like in the center of why you like why we do anything at all. Like this
well,
core one,
yeah,
the core,
yeah.
what's it,
There,
the
there,
sense of Vidala is what it felt like to me.
sorry, I didn't hear you.
It just felt like it was like at the set, it was that mystery is like in the wonderment that it evokes, right?
Yes, very much, very
It's
much.
like why we're doing any of this stuff, right? On some level.
I, and I think we talked about this, and I don't know if it was you and I individually or when we were in the four-way discussion. The how to elucidate that scientifically
Mm.
while maintaining a proper existential reverence towards it. That's a really challenging thing for me. I step back and think about that periodically. So
I would imagine
because
something, it has to do with a lot to do with like this sense of going back and forth, right?
between the theory and the theory, for sure, there's definitely and the Tillichian note, the notion from Tillich of the tonos, the tension, the
Yeah.
creative tension that is never resolvable, and so the opponent processing is always needed.
Yeah.
I think that's helpful. But like, for example, like part of what I've tried to do is well, you can understand self-transcendence in terms of a process that complexifies, and when it complexifies, it gets emergent functions, and those emergent functions exact existing machinery, and all of that sort of takes a little bit of the mystery away in one sense.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, right, it shouldn't. It should be, well, no, because you should still see like, well, but what does, like, your commitment to a way of talking and being and thinking that affords such emergence is still a task that falls on you, right? And that's important to me, because you see this as kind of like when I'm seeing what's going on in Rebel Wisdom and a lot of the dialogue, there's this constant invocation of of being open to emergence, right?
Yeah.
And that's so having done that theorizing I just did with you does not remove, yes, but what's the existential responsibility? What's the reverential attitude I need to bring into existence so that I can be properly open and affording of that emergence?
Right.
That's what I mean about trying to get the two to talk to each other appropriately.
Because it seems, I mean, I know that the last time you and I had talked, we were talking a lot about the proper place for propositional knowing.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And I kind of felt like this. I had this sense. It's like, well, like I guess a really good proposition is allows you to have it's like it's correct to the degree that it has what you're looking at to be like render more of its mystery, right? That it shows its mysteriousness, right? And
yes.
I made it like that. I think that you had talked about at that point. You talked about like, oh, that's a deeper pragmatism. That's the one that James.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what James was on about. I think that, James is struggling because I think his notion of usefulness is basically something like relevance.
Yeah.
And then he's trying to get viability around that. And he tends to sometimes think that that's the same as truth, but I don't think that's quite right.
Yeah.
Because viability has a sense that there's something beyond your desires and needs that you have to be responsible to.
Right.
And the pragmatists need to pay a little bit more. Well, why is something not viable?
Yeah.
Like, if you want it, why is it not viable to you? Something else is at work that you are beholden to and responsible to, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, but I do like that idea about how a proposition, like part of I mean, it depends whether or not we're making knowledge claims or we're trying to afford understanding with our propositions, because we do different things with them, right? But let's say insofar as we're trying to do understanding, and that links up with the hermeneutics, right?
Yeah.
Then, the proposition isn't just in its semantic content, it's how when you drop it into the pragmatic sphere, right,
Yeah.
out of all of its potential implications, some are deemed significant or relevant, and then you grasp
Yeah.
the relevant implications.
Right.
Right. And presumably, if the person has some wisdom in their knowledge pursuit, that's going to shift away that we just talked about. James's notion of viability. Which implications are going to be viable? And that's going to be some sensitivity to your existential mode and
Yeah.
the way in which you are coupled to the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's helping, but I'm thinking the idea that, again, the degree to which a proposition couples you to the world in a way that leads you deeper into it, more ontological depth perception. But I think it's bound up with, again, this idea about how the propositional aligns in its grounding procedural knowing, which aligns and grounds in its it aligns to its grounding perspectival knowing,
Yeah.
which then aligns and grounds in its participatory
Right.
knowing. And so that's
Yeah.
that's how because I mean, I remember saying this in on the dialogue I had with Hamza, that truth is only graspable in transcendence. If we don't take truth as a property in propositions, but as an event, Heideggerian said,
Yeah.
right? It's only in the overcoming of self-deception or a limitation that you can realize that you were deceived or limited. It's only in the transcendence that right. So truth is never a place you land. It's always something you see in transit, right? And so if a proposition is affording that transit, both within and between, I think that's
Totally. And it's something about, like, I'm imagining too, it's like the culture, it's like the communitas, right? Like the community.
oh, very much, very much.
Like what
Yes.
is what is the community? Is it, are people relating to each other in cultivating a sense of wonderment, right, about what they're doing? So like when you go, like if you're a scientist and you go on lunch, like are we just doing formulas, or are we
No, never.
talking
That
about?
was Polanyi's point. That's right. It's also personal. The theoretical knowledge is always situated within the personal knowledge.
Yeah, and it just seems to me that so gets evoked. Well, it gets evoked in a lot of places, but like it can really be evoked in relationship, right?
Oh, very much. I think so.
Like
I
you
think
talked
that's
about,
right.
like you do most of your writing with other people, and like we were just talking about the way that you work.
Oh, yeah. It has to be. It has to be.
Yeah.
I think the best work is always done that way. Well, at least it is for me.
Right.
I should get going soon, Guy. I don't mean to disrupt. Well, we never finish these conversations. We just abandon them because of other constraints.
Yeah.
But I should get going.
However, it's just I want to say it's like they live with me. The conversations live with me.
Oh, very much with me, and they inhabit me as much as I inhabit them.
Oh, totally. It's like there's a way in which I can almost like feel each one of your faces.
Yeah, I think
walking around, just like there's a way that you guys are figures in my mind and a part of.
Chris talks about the way you know, people are characterizations of sets of propositions for us. They bring character to it, and right, and that's
Totally.
definitely the case. Yeah, very much.
Yeah, that last conversation with Chris I had was really, been thinking about that a lot. Like we have.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. I tried to point people to it.
Yeah. All right, John. Awesome.
Very good. Yeah, very good talking to you, Guy. I missed you. It's good to talk to you again.
Okay. Mwah. Let's
take care.
Let's do this. Let's do that project and do everything that we were just talking about.
Yes, very much. Yeah, I like that idea.
Let's do it.
I'll discuss it with Jordan next time I see him, and with Chris as well.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Hey, take care.